The afternoon sun streamed through the tall glass windows of the fancy piano store, making everything inside sparkle and shine. 12-year-old Nina stood near the entrance, barely breathing as she looked around. She'd never seen anything like this before. Beautiful grand pianos lined the showroom floor, each one looking more expensive than her family's entire apartment. The black surfaces were so polished she could see herself in them, and the whole place had that rich smell of expensive wood and leather. Nina wasn't really supposed to be there. Her mother worked as a cleaning lady in the office building right next door, and usually during lunch break, Nina just sat in the small employee room doing her homework. But today was different. She'd finished her schoolwork early, and something kept pulling her toward this piano store. She'd walked past it so many times, always stopping to look through the windows, wondering what it would feel like to actually touch one of those amazing instruments. She took a few careful steps inside. Her old sneakers made tiny squeaking sounds on the shiny marble floor, and she froze for a second, worried someone would notice her. But the few people shopping in the store were too busy, talking to each other or looking at pianos to pay attention to a young girl in a worn-out dress that was getting too small for her. Nina's heart beat faster as she walked closer to the nearest piano. It was huge, probably the biggest piano she'd ever seen in her life. The black surface was so perfect and shiny that she could see her whole face reflected in it. Her fingers started tingling with this strong urge to touch it, to feel those smooth white and black keys under her hands, to hear what kind of beautiful sound such an incredible instrument could make. Back at home, Nina didn't have a piano. Her family could barely pay the rent for their tiny 2-bedroom apartment in the old part of the city. But every single Thursday afternoon, she went to the community center for free piano lessons. An older lady named Mrs. Kim taught her. She was a retired piano teacher who volunteered her time to teach kids who couldn't afford real lessons. The piano at the community center was pretty old and beat up. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them, and a few didn't even make sound anymore. But Nina didn't care. She loved that piano anyway. She practiced on it every chance she got, sometimes staying hours after her lesson ended, her fingers working through songs and exercises until the security guard had to tell her it was time to lock up the building. Now, standing in front of this gorgeous instrument that probably cost more money than she could even imagine, Nina felt her hand reaching out almost on its own. Her fingers were only a few inches away from touching the smooth keys when a loud, angry voice made her jump. "Hey, don't you dare touch that!" Nina yanked her hand back like the piano had just shocked her. Her face got hot with embarrassment as a tall man in a fancy gray suit came rushing toward her. His face looked angry and disgusted as his eyes looked her up and down in a way that made Nina feel about 2 inches tall. "Those pianos cost more than you can imagine," the man said in a cold voice. He was definitely the store manager based on the fancy name tag on his chest and the way he acted like he owned the place. "They're not playthings for random children to mess around with." Nina tried to say something, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come out. Her throat felt tight and her eyes started burning with tears that she desperately tried to hold back. She took a step away from the piano, accidentally bumping into the velvet rope barrier that separated the display area. The noise had gotten everyone's attention now. A fancy-looking woman, probably in her 50s, wearing an expensive cream suit and a pearl necklace that looked like it cost a fortune, turned around to see what all the fuss was about. Her hair was styled perfectly, not a single strand out of place, and her makeup looked like it had been done professionally. "What on earth is that girl doing in here?" the woman said to her friend standing next to her. She didn't even bother lowering her voice. Everyone nearby could hear her clearly. "She obviously doesn't belong in a store like this. Just look at her." Her friend, another wealthy-looking woman with designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, nodded and made a disgusted face. Both of them stared at Nina like she was something dirty they'd found on the bottom of their expensive shoes. Their eyes took in every single detail. Her dress that was too short because she'd grown taller this year, her sneakers with the holes in the sides, her backpack with the broken zipper that she'd fixed with a safety pin. More people were looking now. A young couple who'd been trying out one of the smaller pianos stopped playing and turned to watch. A businessman in the corner put down his phone. An older man browsing near the back of the store looked up from the catalog he'd been reading. Everyone seemed to be staring at Nina, waiting to see what would happen to this poor girl who'd made the mistake of walking into a place where she clearly didn't fit in. The manager crossed his arms and looked down at Nina with a stern expression. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave right now," he said in that cold, harsh voice that made it clear he wasn't asking at all. He was telling her, This is a high-end establishment for serious customers. We can't have just anyone wandering in here off the street touching our merchandise. Nina felt like she was getting smaller and smaller, shrinking under the weight of all those judging eyes and harsh stares. She wanted to explain that she wasn't trying to cause any problems, that she just wanted to see the pianos up close for once in her life, that music was the only thing that made her truly happy. But she couldn't make herself speak. The shame and embarrassment were too overwhelming. These people looked at her and saw nothing but a poor kid who didn't belong, someone not worth their time or respect. She was about to turn around and run out of there as fast as she could, to get back to the safety of her mom's break room where nobody would judge her, when a different voice spoke up. "Hold on just a minute there." Everyone in the showroom turned to see who was talking. An older gentleman had stood up from a comfortable chair tucked away in the corner of the store. He'd been sitting there so quietly that Nina hadn't even noticed him before. He looked like he was probably in his 70s, with white hair and glasses with thin metal frames. Unlike the other customers in their expensive designer clothes, he wore simple, comfortable things: an old brown jacket that looked well worn but clean, regular pants, and ordinary shoes. But somehow the way he stood and spoke made people listen. Even the manager stopped and paid attention. The old man walked toward them slowly, taking his time. His eyes, warm and intelligent behind his glasses, looked at Nina with an expression that was completely different from everyone else. There was no judgment there, no disgust or annoyance, just kindness and genuine interest. "I think we might be jumping to conclusions a bit too quickly here," the elderly man said gently but firmly. He looked right at the manager, who suddenly seemed less confident than he had a moment ago. "This is a music store, isn't it? A place where people come to appreciate and celebrate beautiful instruments and the gift of music?" The manager shifted uncomfortably, not quite sure how to respond. "Well, yes, of course, but these instruments are very valuable, and we can't just allow anyone to—" "Anyone?" The old man interrupted, his eyebrows rising slightly. "I see a young person who was drawn to the beauty of music. That seems like exactly the kind of thing we should be encouraging, not punishing." Then he turned to Nina and gave her a warm, genuine smile. It was the kindest thing anyone had done for her all day. His whole face lit up when he smiled, creating little wrinkles around his eyes that made him look friendly and trustworthy. "Tell me something, young lady," he said softly. "Do you play the piano?" Nina found her voice, though it came out quieter than she intended. "Yes, sir. I take lessons every Thursday at the community center near my house." "That's wonderful," the old man said, and the way he said it made Nina believe he really meant it. Then he did something that made Nina's heart nearly stop beating. He gestured toward the beautiful grand piano, the very same one she'd been about to touch before this whole mess started. "Well then, why don't you play something for us?" "I would absolutely love to hear you play." Nina felt like her heart had stopped completely. Did this kind old man just invite her to play? On that incredible piano? The one that probably cost more money than her family would see in years? She looked at him, then at the piano, then back at him, not quite believing what she'd just heard. The manager's face had gone red. "Sir, I really don't think that's appropriate. These instruments require a certain level of expertise, and we can't just let anyone—" "I'll take full responsibility," the elderly gentleman said calmly, cutting him off mid-sentence. There was something in his voice, quiet but firm, that made the manager stop talking immediately. "If anything happens to the instrument, which I'm quite certain it won't, I will personally cover any damages." The manager's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked around the showroom, clearly torn between his desire to throw Nina out and his reluctance to offend what might turn out to be an important customer. The old man's clothes might have been simple, but there was an air about him that suggested he wasn't someone to be dismissed lightly. The woman in pearls let out a loud snort. "This is ridiculous," she announced to everyone within earshot. "What kind of establishment allows street children to put their hands all over expensive merchandise? I've never seen anything like this in my life." Her friend nodded eagerly. "Absolutely absurd. The girl probably doesn't even know how to play. She's just going to embarrass herself." Nina felt her face burning even hotter now. Maybe they were right. Maybe she was crazy to even think about playing here, in front of all these rich people who clearly thought she was nothing. The piano at the community center was so different from this magnificent instrument. What if she messed up? What if her fingers slipped? What if she hit the wrong keys and proved to everyone that she really didn't belong here? The old man must have sensed her fear because he stepped closer and spoke quietly, just to her. "Don't listen to them, child. Music isn't about money or fancy clothes or what neighborhood you come from. It's about what's in here." He placed a gentle hand over his heart. "And I have a feeling you've got plenty of music in there. Am I right?" Nina looked up into his kind eyes and felt something shift inside her. He believed in her. This stranger who didn't even know her name believed she could do this. She thought about all those hours at the community center, all those times she'd practiced the same pieces over and over until her fingers hurt, all those moments when Mrs. Kim had smiled and told her she had a gift, a real talent that shouldn't be wasted. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll try." The old man's smile grew wider. "That's all any of us can do, dear. Just try our best." Nina walked slowly toward the piano, feeling like she was in some kind of dream. Every eye in the showroom was on her now. Some people looked curious. Others looked skeptical. The woman in pearls looked downright annoyed, like Nina's very presence was ruining her entire day. The manager stood off to the side with his arms crossed, watching with a mixture of concern and frustration on his face. When Nina reached the piano bench, she paused for a moment, running her fingers lightly along the edge of the smooth wood. It was even more beautiful up close. She carefully sat down, adjusting her position on the leather seat until she felt comfortable. The bench was fancier than anything she'd ever sat on before, and she had to resist the urge to run her hands over the soft leather. Her hands hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. Behind her, she heard someone let out an impatient sigh. The woman in pearls muttered something to her friend that ended with, "Waste of time." Nina closed her eyes. She blocked out the whispers, the judgmental stares, the expensive suits and jewelry, the cold marble floor, everything. In her mind, she was back at the community center. It was just her and the music, the way it had always been during her practice sessions. Nothing else mattered when she played. Not the broken keys or the scratched wood or the fact that the piano was older than her mother. When she played, she was free. Her fingers found their home on the keys and she began to play. The first notes of Beethoven's Fürelise floated through the air. It was a piece she'd been working on for months, one that Mrs. Kim had taught her note by note, measure by measure. At first, Nina's fingers felt stiff, nervous. But then something magical started to happen. The piano responded to her touch in a way she'd never experienced before. Every note was clear and pure and perfect. When she pressed the keys softly, the sound was gentle like a whisper. When she pressed harder, the music swelled and filled the entire room. It was like the piano was speaking to her, answering every movement of her fingers with exactly the right sound. Nina forgot about being nervous. She forgot about the people watching. She even forgot about the fact that she was sitting at a piano that cost more money than she could comprehend. All that existed was the music flowing through her fingers, through the keys, into the air around her. Her body began to sway slightly with the melody, the way it always did when she got lost in a piece. Her fingers moved faster now, more confident, dancing across the keys as the music built to more complex passages. She'd practiced this piece so many times that her fingers knew exactly where to go, moving almost on their own. The showroom had gone completely silent, except for the sound of the piano. Nobody was whispering anymore. Nobody was making rude comments or judgmental remarks. Even the manager had uncrossed his arms and was standing very still, his expression changing from annoyance to something else entirely. Nina played through the gentle middle section, her touch light and delicate on the keys. The piano seemed to understand exactly what she wanted, producing sounds so beautiful they almost made her want to cry. This was what music was supposed to sound like. This was what she'd always imagined in her head, but could never quite achieve on the worn-out piano at the community center. As she moved into the final section of the piece, Nina's confidence grew even stronger. Her fingers flew across the keys, hitting every note perfectly, building to the conclusion with a passion and intensity that surprised even her. She wasn't just playing the notes anymore. She was feeling them, living them, pouring everything she had into the music. When she played the final notes and lifted her hands from the keys, the sound seemed to hang in the air for a moment, lingering like perfume. Nina opened her eyes slowly, almost afraid to break the spell. For what felt like forever but was probably only a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire showroom was frozen in complete silence. Then something incredible happened. The elderly gentleman started clapping. Not just a polite golf clap, but real enthusiastic applause. His face was lit up with the biggest smile, and his eyes looked almost wet behind his glasses, like he might actually cry. A second later, another person joined in. Then another. Within moments, everyone in the showroom was clapping. The young couple, the businessman, even some of the sales staff who'd been standing in the back. The sound of applause filled the room, echoing off the high ceiling. Nina sat frozen on the bench, unable to quite process what was happening. They were clapping for her. These people who'd looked at her with such disdain just minutes ago were actually applauding her performance. She turned around slowly and saw faces that looked completely different now. The skepticism was gone. The judgment had vanished. Instead, people were looking at her with something that looked like amazement, like respect, like they were actually seeing her for the first time as a real person instead of just a poor girl who didn't belong. The manager stood there with his mouth hanging open slightly, his face now bright red for a completely different reason than before. He looked embarrassed, maybe even ashamed, but the woman in pearls wasn't clapping. She stood with her arms at her sides, her face twisted into an expression of shock and disbelief. Her friend next to her was clapping awkwardly, clearly not sure what to do, glancing between the performance and her companion. The old gentleman walked up to the piano, still smiling that warm smile. "Extraordinary," he said softly, his voice full of genuine emotion. "Absolutely extraordinary, my dear. Where did you learn to play like that?" Nina's voice came out shaky when she finally found the courage to speak. "I take lessons at the community center," she said quietly, still not quite believing that all these people were looking at her with admiration instead of disgust. "Every Thursday afternoon. My teacher, Mrs. Kim, she's been teaching me for almost 3 years now." The old gentleman nodded, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. 3 years, he repeated thoughtfully. "And I assume you practice quite a bit outside of your lessons?" Nina felt her cheeks get warm, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. "Yes, sir. I stay at the center after my lessons and practice for as long as they'll let me. Sometimes 2 or 3 hours. The security guard, Mr. Peterson, he's really nice about it. He always warns me 15 minutes before he has to lock up." "Dedication," the old man said, nodding approvingly. "That's what separates someone who plays from someone who truly understands music. Talent is wonderful, but without dedication it means nothing." He paused, looking at her thoughtfully. "Tell me, do you have a piano at home to practice on?" Nina shook her head, looking down at her hands that were still resting on the piano keys. "No, sir. We can't afford one. My mom, she works really hard, but pianos cost a lot of money. Even the used ones are too expensive for us." A few people in the crowd made sympathetic sounds. The businessmen who'd been watching earlier had moved closer, genuinely interested now. Even one of the sales staff, a younger guy who'd been organizing sheet music in the corner, had come over to see what all the fuss was about. The manager cleared his throat, and everyone turned to look at him. His face was still red, and he looked incredibly uncomfortable. He started, then stopped, then started again. "I need to apologize, miss. I was extremely rude to you, and that was wrong of me. Very wrong." He took a breath, looking like every word was difficult to get out. "I made assumptions based on appearance, and that's something I'm ashamed of. You clearly have remarkable talent, and I should never have tried to keep you from the piano." Nina didn't know what to say. She'd never had an adult apologize to her like this before, especially not one who'd been so mean just minutes earlier. "It's okay," she mumbled, though part of her still felt the sting of how he'd treated her. "No, it's not okay," the old gentleman said firmly, though his voice remained kind. He looked at the manager with an expression that was gentle but serious. "But it takes courage to admit when we're wrong, and I respect that you've done so." Then he turned back to Nina. "Young lady, I haven't properly introduced myself. My name is Robert Chen, and I'm the director of the Metropolitan Youth Music Academy." Nina's eyes went wide. She'd heard of that place. Every kid who took music lessons in the city had heard of it. It was one of the most prestigious music schools in the entire state, maybe even the country. They had actual concert halls and recording studios and teachers who'd performed at famous venues all over the world. Getting into that academy was like winning the lottery. Only the most talented students were accepted, and even then, the tuition cost more than most families made in a year. I can see from your expression that you know of our institution, Mr. Chen said with a slight smile. We hold auditions twice a year for our scholarship program. These scholarships cover everything: tuition, books, even instrument access. We provide them to exceptionally talented students who might not otherwise have the opportunity to develop their gifts. Nina's heart started beating so fast she thought it might burst right out of her chest. Was he saying what she thought he was saying? The next round of auditions is in 3 weeks, Mr. Chen continued. I would very much like to see you there. Based on what I just heard, I believe you have a real chance of earning one of those scholarships. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Nina. My direct number is on there. Have your mother call my office tomorrow and we'll get you registered for the audition. Nina took the card with trembling hands. The letters on it seemed to blur as her eyes filled with tears she was desperately trying to hold back. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to girls like her. Really? She whispered. You really think I'm good enough? Good enough? Mr. Chen chuckled warmly. My dear, you're more than good enough. What you just displayed wasn't simply technical skill, though your technique is quite solid for someone who's only been playing for 3 years. What impressed me was the emotion, the feeling you put into every note. That's something that can't be taught. Either you have it or you don't, and you most certainly have it. The businessman stepped forward. Excuse me, he said, pulling out his own card. I'm David Wong and I run a music store across town. Nothing as fancy as this place, he said with a glance around the showroom, but we have good quality instruments at more reasonable prices. If you'd like, I can arrange for you to have access to one of our practice rooms, free of charge. We close at 8 most nights, but I can give you a key so you can practice whenever you need to prepare for your audition. Nina couldn't speak. She just stared at him, then at Mr. Chen, then at the card in her hand. This was too much. It was overwhelming. 5 minutes ago, she'd been humiliated and told she didn't belong here. Now people were offering her opportunities she'd only dreamed about. The young couple who'd been playing earlier came up next. We're both music teachers at Lincoln Elementary, the woman said. Her name tag read Jessica. If you need any help preparing for your audition, we'd be happy to work with you. No charge. We could meet on weekends if that works for you. That's very generous of all of you, Mr. Chen said, nodding approvingly at everyone who'd offered to help. The music community takes care of its own, especially when we see genuine talent that deserves to be nurtured. Nina finally found her voice, though it came out scratchy and broken. Thank you, she managed to say. Thank you all so much. I don't know what to say. I never thought... She trailed off as the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled down her cheeks. The elderly gentleman handed her a handkerchief from his pocket. No need to say anything more, dear. Just promise me you'll keep playing. Keep practicing. Keep pouring your heart into the music the way you did today. That's all the thanks any of us need. Nina wiped her eyes and nodded vigorously. I promise. I'll practice every single day. I won't waste this chance. A sound from across the room made everyone turn. The woman in pearls was standing there, her face an interesting shade of purple. She looked furious. This is absolutely ridiculous, she announced loudly. You're all making fools of yourselves over a child who got lucky with one simple piece. Für Elise, please. That's a beginner's song that anyone with 6 months of lessons could play. The room went quiet. Nina felt her stomach drop. Maybe the woman was right. Maybe she had just gotten lucky. Maybe that piano was so good it made her sound better than she actually was. But Mr. Chen just smiled calmly. Mrs. Patterson, I've been in music education for 45 years. I've taught at Juilliard, the Boston Conservatory, and the Royal Academy of Music in London. I've heard thousands of students play thousands of pieces. So when I tell you that this young lady has genuine talent, I'm not speaking from a place of sentimentality or political correctness, as you're probably thinking. I'm speaking from decades of professional experience. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Mr. Chen continued, his voice still gentle but firm. Furthermore, the difficulty of the piece is irrelevant. I've heard professional musicians play complex concertos with perfect technical execution, but without any soul whatsoever. And I've heard students play simple pieces that moved me to tears because of the emotion and understanding they brought to the music. This young lady falls into the latter category. He turned back to Nina. Don't let anyone tell you that your talent isn't real or isn't worth developing. There will always be people who try to diminish others to make themselves feel superior. The mark of a true musician is learning to block out those voices and focus on the music. The manager, who'd been standing quietly during this whole exchange, suddenly spoke up. "Miss," he said to Nina, "I'd like to offer you something as well if you'll accept it. We have a small practice room in the back of the store. It's not being used right now. You're welcome to come here and practice whenever you like. We're open until 6 on weekdays and 4 on Saturdays." Nina looked around at all these people, these strangers who 10 minutes ago hadn't even known she existed, who now wanted to help her. It felt like her whole world had shifted on its axis. Everything had changed so fast she could barely keep up. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why are you all being so nice to me?" Mr. Chen smiled that warm grandfatherly smile again. "Because, my dear, when we see something special, something worth preserving and nurturing, we have a responsibility to help it grow. Your talent is a gift, not just to you, but to everyone who will have the privilege of hearing you play in the years to come. We're not being nice. We're being smart. We're investing in something beautiful." Nina stood there holding all the business cards people had given her, still trying to process everything that had just happened. It felt like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Things like this didn't happen to her. They happened in movies or in stories, not to 12-year-old girls whose moms cleaned office buildings for a living. Mrs. Patterson made a huffing sound and grabbed her friend's arm. "Come on, Patricia. We're leaving. I refuse to spend another minute in a store that treats ordinary customers this way." She shot one last angry look at Nina before marching toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Her friend Patricia hesitated for just a moment, glancing back at Nina with an expression that was hard to read. Was it regret? Embarrassment? Whatever it was, she quickly followed Mrs. Patterson out the door without saying a word. The manager watched them leave and let out a long breath, like he'd been holding it in. "Well," he said, running a hand through his hair, "there goes one of our regular customers. But honestly, after seeing what just happened, I think it was worth it." He looked at Nina with a small, genuine smile. "I meant what I said about the practice room, really. Come by any time. Just ask for me at the front desk." "My name is Tom." He extended his hand and Nina shook it, still feeling like she was in some kind of dream. Mr. Chen checked his watch, an old-fashioned one with a leather band. "I should be going as well. I have a faculty meeting at the academy in an hour." He placed a gentle hand on Nina's shoulder. "But remember what I said. Have your mother call my office tomorrow. We'll get everything sorted out for the audition. And don't be nervous about it. Just play the way you played today and everything will work out exactly as it should." "I will, sir." "Thank you so much," Nina said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll practice really hard. I promise." "I know you will," Mr. Chen said warmly. He nodded to the others in the showroom, gave Tom the manager a meaningful look that seemed to say, "Take care of this one," and then walked toward the exit with that same calm, measured pace he'd had when he first stood up to defend her. After he left, the businessman, David Wong, came over again. "Here," he said, pressing his card more firmly into Nina's hand. "I'm serious about that practice room. My store is just 15 minutes from here by bus. The number 53 stops right in front. Come by this week and I'll show you around, get you set up with a key. We have 3 practice rooms and honestly, they don't get used as much as they should." "Thank you," Nina said again. She seemed to be saying thank you a lot today, but she couldn't help it. Every person here was offering her something she desperately needed, something she'd never thought she'd have access to. Jessica and her husband, the music teachers from Lincoln Elementary, approached next. "We usually spend Saturday mornings at a coffee shop on Maple Street grading papers and planning lessons," Jessica said. "If you wanted to meet us there, we could work with you on audition prep, help you choose pieces, work on any rough spots, that kind of thing." Her husband nodded enthusiastically. "Jessica used to teach at a performing arts high school before we moved here. She knows exactly what audition panels look for. And I studied classical piano in college, so between the two of us, we should be able to help you get ready." Nina felt her eyes starting to water again. "You'd really do that for me? You don't even know me." "That's the thing about musicians," Jessica said with a kind smile. "We're all part of the same family in a way. When one of us succeeds, we all feel it. And watching you play just now, seeing the joy on your face and hearing the emotion in every note, that reminded both of us why we fell in love with music in the first place." The young sales assistant who'd been watching everything unfold came over carrying a small bag. "I don't have much to offer like everyone else," he said, looking a bit shy. "But we have some sheet music that's been sitting in the back room forever. Classical pieces, different difficulty levels. I grabbed a bunch that I think would be good for auditions." He handed Nina the bag. "It's just going to get recycled anyway if no one takes it, so you'd actually be doing us a favor." Nina peeked inside the bag and saw at least 20 booklets of music. Pieces by Mozart, Bach, Chopin, composers she'd heard of but never had the chance to learn because sheet music cost money her family didn't have. "Are you sure?" she asked, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Absolutely," he said with a grin. "Make good use of them. And hey, when you're famous someday, maybe you can mention that Carlos from the piano store gave you your first big break." He was joking, but his eyes were sincere. Nina laughed for the first time since this whole crazy experience began. A real, genuine laugh that came from deep in her belly. "I promise," she said. "If I ever get famous, I'll tell everyone about Carlos and his magic bag of sheet music." The small crowd that had gathered started to disperse slowly. Some people went back to browsing pianos, though Nina noticed several of them kept glancing her way with smiles on their faces. The businessman, David, headed toward the exit but turned back one more time. "Don't forget this week. Come by the store." "I won't forget," Nina promised. Soon it was just Nina, Tom the manager, and Carlos the sales assistant left in that section of the showroom. Nina looked down at the beautiful grand piano she'd just played, the one that had started all of this. She reached out and gently touched the smooth black surface, running her fingers along the edge the way she'd done before. Except, this time, no one yelled at her. This time she belonged here. "You know," Tom said quietly, "I've worked in this store for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of people play these pianos. Professional musicians, wealthy collectors, serious students preparing for competitions. But I've never seen anyone play with the kind of pure feeling you had. It reminded me why I took this job in the first place, why I wanted to work around music." He paused, seeming to struggle with something he wanted to say. "I grew up poor too," he finally admitted. "Not quite as poor as some, but we didn't have much. My dad worked construction, and my mom waited tables. I learned to play on a keyboard someone donated to our church. Never thought I'd amount to anything in music because people like us, we don't usually get those chances, you know?" Nina nodded. She understood exactly what he meant. "But I got lucky," Tom continued. "A teacher believed in me, helped me get into a decent college. I'm not a performer or anything, never had quite enough talent for that. But I made a life around music anyway. Working here, helping people find the right instruments, that's how I stayed connected to what I love." He looked at Nina seriously. "What I'm trying to say is don't let anyone make you feel like you don't deserve this. You do. Your talent deserves to be developed. And people like Mr. Chen, they don't offer scholarships lightly. If he thinks you have what it takes, then you definitely do." Nina felt a lump forming in her throat again. "I'm scared," she admitted in a whisper. "What if I mess up the audition? What if I'm not as good as he thinks I am? What if today was just a fluke?" Tom shook his head firmly. "It wasn't a fluke, trust me. And yes, you'll be nervous during the audition. Everyone is. But here's the secret they don't tell you. The judges, they're not looking for perfection. They're looking for potential. They're looking for students who have that special something, that spark that can't be taught. And you've got it in abundance." Carlos chimed in from where he was straightening some displays nearby. "Plus you've got like a whole team of people ready to help you now." "That's pretty awesome." Nina smiled, clutching the bag of sheet music to her chest along with all the business cards. "Yeah," she said softly. "It really is." At that moment, the door to the showroom opened and Nina's mother rushed in looking worried and confused. "Nina, baby, what are you doing here?" "I've been looking all over for you. You weren't in the break room and I—" She stopped abruptly, taking in the scene. Her daughter standing by an expensive piano, holding a bag and a handful of business cards, with store employees standing around her smiling. "Mom," Nina said, and suddenly everything that had been building up inside her came rushing out. The words tumbled over each other as she tried to explain everything that had happened. The piano, the manager yelling at her, the kind old man who turned out to be the director of the Metropolitan Youth Music Academy, the performance, the applause, the scholarship audition, all the people who wanted to help her. Her mother's eyes got wider and wider as Nina talked, one hand pressed to her mouth. When Nina finally finished pulling out Mr. Chen's business card to show her, her mother's eyes filled with tears. "The Metropolitan Academy," she whispered. Nina, do you know how prestigious that is? Kids from wealthy families spend years trying to get in there. Mr. Chen said I have a real chance at a scholarship, Nina explained, the words still feeling unreal as she said them. He said to call his office tomorrow to register for the audition. Her mother pulled Nina into a tight hug, not caring that they were in a fancy store or that people might be watching. I'm so proud of you, baby, she said, her voice muffled against Nina's hair. So proud. Tom cleared his throat gently. Ma'am, your daughter is incredibly talented. We'd be honored to have her use our practice facilities as she prepares for her audition. Nina's mother pulled back from the hug, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she said to Tom, then to Carlos, her voice shaky with emotion. Thank you both so much for being kind to her. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of practice and preparation that Nina would remember for the rest of her life. True to their word, every single person who'd offered to help her actually followed through. That almost never happened in Nina's experience. Usually when adults said they'd do something, it was just polite talk that didn't mean anything. But this time was different. The very next day after school, Nina and her mother took the bus to David Wong's music store. It was smaller than the fancy showroom where everything had happened, but it felt warmer somehow, more welcoming. David showed them around personally, introducing Nina to his small staff and taking them to the practice rooms in the back. They were simple spaces, nothing fancy, just a room with a piano, a chair, and good lighting. But to Nina, they might as well have been concert halls. David handed her a key on a blue lanyard. This is yours to keep, he said. The alarm code is written on this card. You can come in any time we're closed, practice as long as you want. Just lock up when you're done and reset the alarm. Nina's mother tried to protest, saying it was too much, too generous, but David waved her concerns away. Mrs. Torres, your daughter has a gift. The only tragedy would be if that gift went to waste because she didn't have access to an instrument. This is the least I can do. That first evening, Nina practiced for 3 hours straight. Her fingers flew over the keys as she worked through the pieces she'd chosen for her audition. She'd decided on 3 songs, the Furalese that everyone had already heard, a Mozart sonata that Mrs. Kim had taught her last year, and a more challenging Chopin prelude from the sheet music Carlos had given her. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, Nina met Jessica and her husband Mark at the coffee shop on Maple Street. They'd sit in the corner booth with hot chocolate for Nina and coffee for them, going over her pieces measure by measure. Jessica had a way of explaining things that made everything click into place. She'd talk about the story behind each piece, what the composer was feeling when they wrote it, how to bring out the emotion in every phrase. You're not just playing notes, Jessica would say over and over. You're telling a story. Every piece of music has a beginning, a middle, and an end, just like any good story. Make the judges feel something. Mark worked with her on the technical aspects, helping her smooth out rough transitions and nail the tricky passages that kept giving her trouble. He recorded her on his phone so she could hear herself play, pointing out places where she rushed or where her dynamics could be stronger. Tom kept his promise too. Twice a week, Nina would stop by the piano showroom and practice in the small back room he'd offered her. Sometimes when business was slow, Tom would come listen, sitting quietly in the corner and nodding encouragingly. Once he brought her a book about famous pianists, stories of people who'd overcome poverty and hardship to become legends. Thought you might like to read about some folks who started out like you, he'd said simply. Mrs. Kim, her original teacher at the community center, was over the moon with excitement. She started giving Nina extra lessons, refusing to accept any payment. You're doing this for both of us, Mrs. Kim told her with tears in her eyes. I always knew you were special, Nina. I just didn't have the resources to give you everything you deserved. But now you have a real chance, and that makes my heart so happy. The night before the audition, Nina barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the small room she shared with her younger sister, running through the pieces in her mind, her fingers moving silently against her blanket as if playing invisible keys. What if she forgot the notes? What if her hand shook too much? What if the judges didn't like her playing? What if Mr. Chen had been wrong about her talent? Her mother must have heard her tossing and turning because she came and sat on the edge of Nina's bed. Can't sleep, baby? Nina shook her head. I'm so nervous, Mom. What if I mess everything up? Her mother stroked her hair gently, the way she used to when Nina was little. Let me tell you something. No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm already so proud of you I could burst. You've worked harder these past 3 weeks than I've ever seen anyone work. You've shown up for every practice, taken advantage of every opportunity, and never once complained. That takes character, Nina. That takes heart. But what if it's not enough? Nina whispered. Then we'll figure something else out, her mother said firmly. But I don't think that's going to happen. I heard you practicing last night, and Nina, I don't know much about classical music, but even I could tell that what you're doing is something special. You made me cry with that Chopin piece, and I don't cry easy. Nina smiled a little despite her nerves. That's just because you're my mom. You have to think I'm good. No, her mother said seriously. I have to love you. Thinking you're good is a choice, and it's one I make because it's true. Now get some sleep. You've got a big day tomorrow. The Metropolitan Youth Music Academy building was even more intimidating than Nina had imagined. It was this huge modern structure with glass walls and perfectly manicured gardens. Students walked around carrying instrument cases, all of them looking confident and put together in ways that made Nina feel small in her nicest dress, which was still obviously secondhand. Her mother squeezed her hand as they walked through the entrance. Remember, baby, you belong here just as much as anyone else. The waiting area for auditions was filled with other kids and their parents. Nina recognized some of them from around the city. Children of doctors, lawyers, business owners. One girl had a professional-looking portfolio and was talking loudly about the private conservatory she'd been attending since she was 5. A boy in an expensive suit sat perfectly still, his face blank like he'd done this 100 times before. Nina felt her confidence starting to crumble. These kids had advantages she'd never had. Years of expensive lessons, access to the best instruments, probably whole rooms in their houses dedicated to practice. What was she thinking? How could she possibly compete? Then she saw Mr. Chen walking down the hallway. When he spotted her, his whole face lit up with that same warm smile from the piano store. He came over immediately. Nina, I'm so glad to see you here. How are you feeling? Terrified, Nina admitted honestly. Mr. Chen chuckled. Good, that means you care. The day you stop getting nervous before a performance is the day you should worry. He leaned in a little closer and lowered his voice. I'm not on your audition panel, of course. That wouldn't be fair to the other candidates. But I wanted you to know that I've been telling all my colleagues about you. They're very excited to hear you play. That didn't actually make Nina feel less nervous, but somehow it helped anyway. At least Mr. Chen still believed in her. When they called her name, Nina stood on shaky legs. Her mother gave her one last hug. Remember why you play, she whispered. Not for them, for you. For the love of music. The audition room was smaller than Nina expected, but still formal and intimidating. 3 judges sat behind a long table, their faces neutral and professional. A beautiful grand piano waited in the center of the room, spotlighted by overhead lights. Nina walked to the piano on legs that felt like jelly. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. For a moment, everything went quiet in her head. All the noise, all the worry, all the fear just stopped. She thought about that day in the piano showroom, how the music had saved her from humiliation and opened up a world of possibilities. She thought about Mrs. Kim's patient teaching, about David's generosity, about Jessica and Mark's guidance, about her mother working long hours to give Nina a better life. And then she began to play. Her fingers moved across the keys with confidence and grace, telling the story that each piece held within it. She poured everything she had into the music, all her hope, all her dreams, all the love she felt for these beautiful sounds that had given her life meaning and purpose. When she finished the last note of her final piece, she looked up at the judges. Their faces were no longer neutral. One of them was smiling. Another was writing notes furiously. The third, an older woman with silver hair, was looking at Nina with an expression that reminded her of Mr. Chen's face in the piano store. Thank you, Nina, the silver-haired woman said warmly. That was absolutely lovely. We'll be in touch within 2 weeks with our decision. Nina stood, thanked them, and walked out of the room. Her mother jumped up from her seat the moment she appeared. How did it go? I don't know, Nina said honestly. But Mom, I played my best. I really did. Whatever happens, I left everything I had in that room. Her mother hugged her tight. That's all anyone can ever ask for, baby. That's all anyone can ever ask for. 2 weeks later, a thick envelope arrived in the mail addressed to Nina Torres. Her hands shook as she opened it, her mother standing behind her with her hands on Nina's shoulders. The letter started with one simple word: Congratulations. Nina had been accepted into the Metropolitan Youth Music Academy with a full scholarship covering tuition, materials, and instrument access. There was also a note at the bottom in handwriting she recognized as Mr. Chen's. I told you that you had something special. Now the real work begins. Welcome to your future. Nina and her mother both cried, holding each other in their tiny kitchen while her little sister danced around them asking what was happening. That evening, Nina called everyone who'd helped her. David, Tom, Jessica, and Mark, Mrs. Kim. They all celebrated with her, their voices filled with genuine joy. And that night,
Nina went to David's store and practiced on the piano that had become so familiar to her over the past weeks.
but this time she wasn't practicing for an audition. She was playing for pure joy, for the love of music itself, for the little girl who'd once been too afraid to touch a beautiful piano, but had found the courage to try anyway. Sometimes, she thought, all it takes is one moment of bravery and one person willing to see your worth. From there, everything can change.